The Sunday School lesson for March 15th is Power Like No Other. The main point of the lesson is Jesus has power over all my fears. The focal passage for the lesson is Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. Mark chapter 4 begins with a large crowd coming to hear Jesus teach. He was on the shore of the Sea of Galilee and took advantage of some nearby boats. He got into a boat, probably owned by either Peter's family or the Zebedee family. If you remember, Peter and Andrew are brothers, and they were professional fishermen. James and John were also brothers. Their father was Zebedee, and they were professional fishermen. In fact, we see indication that both families had multiple boats, and it could be that both families were in partnership in fishing. Much of Jesus' ministry was centered around the Sea of Galilee, which is actually known by a whole bunch of different names. The Sea of Chinnereth, the Lake of Chinnereth, Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias. It just all depended on who you were talking to. It just had a bunch of multiple different names. And Jesus frequently traveled around the Sea of Galilee. He sometimes would cross over using his disciples' boats, or sometimes he would just skirt the shore. Many times he preached along the shore. And he also made his base of operations the city of Capernaum, which was on the Sea of Galilee. Now, in this particular instance, Jesus got into a boat to teach the crowd that lined the seashore. This was an ideal setting for teaching. The sloping shore would have made a natural amphitheater, and the water would have acted as a sounding board to amplify Jesus' voice. And Jesus took advantage of the opportunity by teaching all day. Mark records just a handful of the parables from that particular lesson, but Jesus taught more than what's recorded. In fact, we would probably, if we were there that day, we would have heard much of what is taught in the Sermon on the Mount, as well as some other teachings. Jesus gave it to them all that day, speaking for hours. In fact, there's no indication that he ever left the boat. He was always in the boat teaching that day. And as evening came, which probably we would consider it late afternoon, he was tired. And you could understand that. It was an exhausting day of teaching. And he was tired, so Jesus directed the disciples to cross over to the other side of the lake. Now, it's not exactly clear why he wanted to cross over. Chapter 5 kind of explains why. But we start our reading on our focal passage in Mark chapter 4, verse 35. And the same day, when the even was come, he saith unto them, Let us pass over unto the other side. And sending away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship. And there was also with them other little ships. And there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the ship, so that it was now full, and he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And we'll stop there for a moment. Jesus did not say why he wanted to cross over. Chapter 5 tells us of another miracle that Jesus had planned out. He just didn't tell his disciples. The disciples probably assumed that Jesus just wanted to get some time away from the crowds, and there was probably something to that as well. Frequently, Jesus needed some time alone to refresh, to pray, and just to get some rest. So he got into the back of the boat, into the lower part, possibly even below a small area of decking, and laid down and went to sleep. Meanwhile, the disciples dispersed the crowds and got the boat underway. Now, there were some other boats there as well, and they joined in the sailing. They could have been other people who were interested in Jesus' teaching, who had been listening from boats. I think more likely these are boats that also belonged to the families of Peter, James, and Andrew, and John. Again, both of those families had multiple boats, and often the boats traveled together. It just made sense. They would be able to capitalize when they found a good fishing site. They would be able to render aid to one another. So they just basically traveled together. So small contingent of vessels on the lake traveling across the other side. Now, as they were journeying across the Sea of Galilee, a powerful storm arose. The Sea of Galilee is part of a Rift Valley formation. In fact, it's called the Jordan Rift Valley. And there's basically a fault line that runs through that area. It separates the African plate from the Asian plate, two major geologic formations. And the fault line runs basically down from the Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea. The Jordan River follows the fault line between the two bodies of water. The Sea of Galilee is the second lowest lake in the world as far as low down in altitude. The Dead Sea is the lowest lake. The Sea of Galilee is the lowest freshwater lake, freshwater body of water. Of course, the Dead Sea is a salt sea. That's why I call it dead, because nothing can live in it. But because of it being in a rift valley, that means you have a lot of mountains and steep cliffs and other very harsh geologic features that surround this valley. And that has an impact on ravine through these valleys as well, channeling the air, and the sudden drop off. It just creates a good environment for winds and storms. In addition, to the east, you have basically the wilderness. You have dry air, heat, basically desert conditions to the east. To the west, you have the Mediterranean Sea, a lot of moist air. And when this moist air and the dry air come together, it generates thunderstorms. So it's an area where they have a lot of storms. And these storms were quite capable of sinking fishing boats that transverse the sea. In fact, we know, because of the storms, we know quite a bit about these fishing vessels. In 1986, Israel experienced an intense drought, and the Sea of Galilee dropped to record lows. In the mud where the sea had receded, a boat was discovered. The Israeli Antiquities Authority, basically they're in charge of all archaeological finds in Israel, they were called in and they discovered they had a remarkable find. It was a boat that had been covered in mud at the bottom of the sea for close to 2,000 years. The boat was from the time of Jesus. It was approximately 26.5 feet long and 7.5 feet wide. It could hold about 15 people, including 4 rowers and a helmsman. It probably had both fore and aft decks and a central mast and sail, with positions for 2 sets of oars on both sides. And the boat that was found was largely, the hull was largely intact, along with some of the decking. Now the boat sank in a storm. Apparently it sank immediately in a storm and was covered in the mud, and the mud preserved the boat for centuries. And they did a very good job of recovering the boat. They had to be very careful in how they took it out of the mud in order to preserve the wood. It's kind of petrified. And now that boat sits in a museum in Galilee. And it shows us what boats were like in Jesus' day, which remarkably, they haven't changed that much from what they're used to using fishing on the Sea of Galilee even into the 20th century. So storms were quite common in Galilee on the sea. The disciples were well aware of the dangers. They had grown up on the lake and knew the dangers of the storms. Their boats were simple and not built to withstand major storms. Typically, they would head to shore at the site of one of the storms, but this time they were crossing the lake and had no available shelter. Mark tells us that the waves were beating against the ship and the ship was taking on water. They were in danger of being swamped and sunk. Experienced fishermen recognized that they were in mortal danger. Ironically, their rabbi, a carpenter, was sleeping in the rear of the boat. In fact, we are told that Jesus was just sleeping on a cushion. He had no concerns. Now, typically, people who are not sailors would get scared at the sight of the boat filling up with water. But Jesus wasn't the least bit concerned. We're told that he was back there just napping. Now that statement is significant for several reasons. First, it demonstrates the humanity of Jesus. He slept because he was physically exhausted. He had taught all day and was in need of some rest. Second, Jesus was at perfect peace. He was not just a deep sleeper. He simply didn't have any worries about storms. He knew when he would die, and he also knew that he would not lose any of the disciples. In Gethsemane, Jesus prayed to God in John 17:12, "While I was with them in the world, I kept them in thy name. Those that thou gavest me I kept, and none of them is lost but the son of perdition, that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Jesus acknowledged that God had given him disciples, and he had not lost any of them. When Jesus was arrested, he directed that his disciples should go free, and none of his disciples died during his earthly ministry. They were safe because Jesus was also protected and protecting them. None would die outside of God's will. Being around Jesus was really the safest place to be, whether there was a storm or whether it was a sunny day. There was no way that God would allow that boat to sink. Third, details matter. Historians look at the detail of Jesus laying on a cushion in the boat as evidence of an eyewitness. That's just not something that someone would make up. It's too small a detail, and Mark includes that detail because he got the story directly from an eyewitness, and it made an impression on that eyewitness. Of course, that eyewitness was Peter. Much of Mark is Peter's sermons being dictated or being heard by Mark and being written down. So Peter remembers that what seems like a small detail, but for historians that's a big deal, because it's small details like that that verify the authenticity of the story. It's not a made-up story. It's not a myth. It is a real factual account. Now we go on. The rest of Mark 4:38. And they awake him and say unto him, Master, carest thou not that we perish? And he arose and rebuked the wind and said unto the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Now the disciples were scared, and they realized that Jesus was asleep. They wanted Jesus to do something. I don't think they wanted an extra hand to bail water, but they probably wanted him to pray and seek God's intervention. They knew that his prayers had power. They had seen him perform miracles. I'm not sure that they were expecting a full miracle at this time, though. But they were upset. Again, they expected a landlubber to be a little disconcerted. Instead, Jesus was at perfect peace and perfect calm, and that disturbed them a little bit. They wanted him to show at least some excitement. In fact, they're kind of irritated, angry even. Don't you care that we're going to die? But when Jesus arose, he didn't start to pray. Instead, he simply rebuked the wind and the sea. He told the weather and the sea to calm down. Essentially, he said, Hush, be quiet, and everything calmed down. Jesus was not invoking God to fix things. Rather, Jesus directly addressed the elements and they obeyed him. The Old Testament teaches that only God has power over the weather or over the seas. Job chapter 12 verse 15 says, Behold, he withholdeth the waters, and they dry up. Also he sendeth them out, and they overturn the earth. Job 28:25 says, To make the weight for the winds, and he weigheth the waters by measure, when he made a decree for the rain, and a way for the lightning of the thunder. In other words, God has complete control over both the weather and the oceans. Psalm 33:7 says, He gathereth the waters of the sea together as a heap. He layeth up the depth in storehouses. The weather is no big deal to God. The sea is no big deal to God. And keep in mind, when you read the Old Testament, for the most part, the Jews were not sailors. There were very few Jews. Naturally, there was only one natural seaport during Old Testament times for Israel, and that was at Joppa. Otherwise, they didn't have a decent port. And most of their nautical endeavors did not fare very well. So the Jews were they were not sailors, and they were not known as sailors, and they had a certain fear of the ocean. The ocean represented chaos. It represented darkness in the world. But they also recognized that even though the sea was a scary place, God still controlled it and created it and had power over it. Psalm 107 verse 23 says, They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord, and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. They mount up to the heaven, they go down again into the depths. Their soul is melted because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man, and are at their wits' end. Then they cry unto God in their trouble, and he bringeth them out of their distresses. He maketh the storm a calm, so that the waves thereof are still. Then they are glad, because they be quiet. So he bringeth them unto their desired haven. Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. Again, we have that picture of a ship being tossed at sea, rising up on the crest of a wave and then crashing down to the base of a trough of a wave. And the men being thrown about the decking because of the uncertain waters. Well, what do? They pray to God, and God is the one who brings calm. Amos 4:13, For lo, he that formeth the mountains, and createth the wind, and declareth unto man what is his thought, that maketh the morning darkness, and treadeth upon the high places of the earth, the Lord, the God of hosts, is his name. Again, only God has power over weather and nature. Weather is one of the few things that humanity, we try to control it to some extent, but we fail. We even try to predict it, and we fail miserably at that. Only God retains that power. Now, God alone has power over nature, and Jesus demonstrated that same power over nature. Jesus has the authority and power to control the earth and all that is in it. This is a major declaration that Jesus has power and authority equal to God the Father. What they saw Jesus do, they would understand as Jews that only God had power to do that. Other nationalities around them prayed to various gods for the storm. In fact, oftentimes the chief top gods were in control of the storm. In ancient Canaan, they prayed to Baal about the storms. In other nations, like for example, in Greece, they would pray to Poseidon, who was the god of the seas, and Zeus was considered to be the god of the storm. For Romans, it was Neptune over the seas and Jupiter over the storms. But they would praise various pagan gods, and the Jews responded, no, only God has that power. Only God controls the earth. And here Jesus, he doesn't pray to God. Not that he doesn't do that all the time, but rather he acts as God. He's making a declaration that he is divine. Mark 4:40. And he said unto them, Why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith? And they feared exceedingly, and said one to another, What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? After rebuking the storm, Jesus rebuked his disciples. They should have had more faith. If they understood that he was the Messiah, then they should have trusted in him. Faith is really the opposite of fear. However, the faith of the disciples was still weak at this time. They didn't immediately respond in faith to Jesus' miracle. They were amazed and astonished at the miracle, but they were also terrified. They recognized that Jesus demonstrated power that belonged only to God. The calming of the storm is an act that is known as a theophany. A theophany is when God gives a clear physical demonstration of his presence to man. In the Old Testament, we see several theophanies, such as the burning bush. God appeared to Moses through the burning bush. In the fiery furnace with Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, God had a physical manifestation in the midst of that flame to guide the three Hebrews through the flames, but also to let King Nebuchadnezzar know that they were chosen of him. Another example of theophany is Isaiah's vision in Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah goes into the temple to offer up incense, and when he does so, he sees this massive vision before him. Ezekiel has a similar vision on the banks of a river in Babylon when he sees God's throne approaching the exiles. These are visions, yes, but they are also revelation of God. Elijah had a similar revelation when he was running. He ran down to Mount Sinai, and while he was down there, he saw all kinds of cataclysmic events, tornadoes, earthquakes, and God was not present in those. He caused them, but he wasn't present. But then God was present in a still small voice. That's another theophany. Again, it is a physical, audible, visual demonstration of God's presence with man. When Jesus calmed the storm, it was a theophany because it was God revealing himself in their midst. Jesus is God come to man. And the calming of the storm demonstrates that Jesus is God. He is God with us, Emmanuel. Now, the most important thing is the calming of the storm demonstrates that Jesus is God and has all authority and power. And before ascending into heaven, Jesus declared that all authority in heaven and on earth belongs to him. And because of that, he empowers us to his service. Those who have a relationship with Jesus as Lord and Savior have access to all that power. Now, this does not mean that we will never experience a storm. For example, the Apostle Paul himself was in a storm and was shipwrecked on more than one occasion. It's not that Paul lacked faith, it was rather that Paul had faith that it would see him through storms. Scott Crepane years ago had a song called "Sometimes He Calms the Storm, and Sometimes He Calms His Child." And sometimes God doesn't say, I'm going to remove the storm. Sometimes God says, I will see you through the storm. And then it is a matter of faith for us to trust that God will see us through. In fact, had they not woken Jesus, the disciples still would have made it to safe harbor. That ship was not going to sink. If they really understood who Jesus was at that time, and they had faith in Jesus and in God, there was no way that ship would have sunk. They could have handled it much more calmly. But instead, they were weak at that time, weak in their faith. We get weak in our faith as well at times, when we don't trust that God will see us through. Sometimes God's going to deliver us in a miraculous way, and sometimes the miracle is that God keeps us safe through the event. We don't need to fear in the midst of the storm if we trust in Jesus. We may experience it, we may have hard times, but we will still make it through. And that's a great blessing for us today. If you believe in Jesus, have faith, he has all the power and all the authority and the wisdom to use it. We can trust in him. The story of Jesus calming the storm reminds me of a hymn entitled Eternal Father Strong to Save. It's also called the Navy Hymn. It has been used in various capacities by both the Royal Navy, the United States Navy, and various navies around the world. Its words are often adopted and adapted to fit different services. There's even a special version for the SEALs. I don't know that version, but I do know the original one, and it goes like this. Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arm doth bind the restless wave, who bids the mighty ocean deep its own appointed limits keep. O hear us when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea. O Saviours, whose almighty word the winds and waves submissive heard, who walked on the foaming deep, and calm amid its rage did sleep. O hear us when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea. Those are just two verses of it. There are more verses in various versions, but again, it's a good testimony, a good instance of where Scripture is put to music. Thank you for watching this Sunday School lesson. I pray that it's a blessing to you. This lesson is intended as a help for those preparing for Sunday School, as well as for those who are unable to attend. We also hope that you would share this with others, and hope that it will be a blessing to them as well. If you're able to attend, we invite you to join us at Ebenezer Baptist Church. We are located at 7305 Highway 166, Douglasville, Georgia, 30135. The church is located on Highway 166. We are approximately 1 mile east of Highway 5. So you can take Highway 5 south from I-20, take exit 166 east, and we're approximately a mile on the right. We are a traditional Southern Baptist church that is involved in missions both through the local association, West Metro Baptist Association, through Georgia Baptist Convention, and through Southern Baptist entities such as North American Mission Board, International Mission Board. We are contributors and we support them in prayer and in any other way we can. I invite you to come join us, visit us for a service, and we can tell you more about our ministries and what we're working with right now. Again, thank you for watching, and please come visit us.